Today we're going to pick up exactly where we left off on this mahogany and maple guitar build. The body is pretty much done. Now it's time to start working on the neck. That's what we're going to do today. I'm Jeff and you're watching Home Built Workshop. What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to the workshop. I hope your day's going awesome. In the first episode of this build, we got this body pretty well ready to go. I had to replace the top. We've got everything routed. The grain has been filled and it's sanded right now up to 320 grit, which is far enough where we can set this aside and focus on a neck because, well, a guitar is not really all that good without a neck. Quite a while back, I batched out a bunch of neck blanks, and while I was trying to determine if I could use one of those neck blanks or maybe make a new one, this piece of flamed maple caught my eye, and I think it's going to look awesome on this build. A couple things that are kind of cool about this is actually a lefty neck, but we're going to use it as a righty, which is going to make it a reverse headstock, so we'll have to reverse the logo, which is really no big deal. I've got the truss rod channel already cut in here, but I don't have the slots in here for the carbon fiber rods, which I like to use now because I really like the extra stability that I feel it gives to a neck. So that's where we're going to start off. Since the truss rod channel is already cut, I used a small square placed inside the truss rod channel to give me a solid point to measure from so that I could lay out the locations for the carbon fiber rods. With the measurements in place, then I just connected the dots to make a center line for the rods. Now my process for cutting truss rod slots and as well as these slots for the carbon fiber rods, really, it can't get a whole lot simpler, I don't think. I just use this simple plywood jig. This is some 1/2-inch plywood. I've got some guide rails on here, keeps the router parallel. I just glued this all together, then used the router to cut this slot so that I know it's nice and straight. And really, I just double stick tape it on my center line, whether it's for the truss rod or the carbon fiber rods, and it works awesome. You make multiple passes, slowly increasing your depth until you get to where you need. It works great. You don't have to have some overly complicated jig. There's lots of different ways that I've seen people cut their truss rod slots, and whatever method works for you, this is what's been working really good for me. It's what we're going to use again. I've got an 1/8-inch straight cutting bit in my router, and right now I'm just going to sort of eyeball it to where it's close to the end where I need to stop, but not exactly. I have an adjustable stop that I can set, which gives a really nice hard stopping point for the router so that I don't go too far. I know right now that I'm just a little bit shy of where I need to be after I make the first pass, then I'll nudge that stop out slowly till I get as far as I need to go. Really now, we can start making shallow passes until we get to the depth of the carbon fiber rods. To set my final depth, I've got a scrap of the same plywood that my jig is made from, and I just keep that around just so that I can get the thickness of the jig, and then I adjust the router bit above that. That way I know it's going to come out right where I need it. After cutting the first slot, I'll just reposition the jig, stick it back down, and cut the second slot. Both ends feel nice and flush. I don't want to shove that fully down in there yet because it's kind of tricky to get out. With the routing for the truss rod and the carbon fiber rods complete, Now we can focus on making a fretboard. Oh, and remember what I said about test fitting these carbon fiber rods? I knew better, and yet I still pushed them down in all the way. They're there permanently now. At least everything's nice and flush. For the fretboard, I'm going to use a leftover piece of the fretboard from the last acoustic guitar. This is Bolivian rosewood, I believe otherwise known as Pau Ferro. It's going to make a cool fretboard. It's going to be a nice look. I like this sap wood in here. Now we just got to get set up and cut some fret slots. I'll first square up one edge on my shooting board. That way I have a nice square reference surface. I've got my freshly jointed edge down. I'm going to use my tabletop to keep everything in alignment. And just like that, we are ready to cut some fret slots. While you're watching me cut fret slots in what seems like super speed, I want to take just a second and say thank you for clicking on this video. I know there's a lot of stuff to watch here, and I want to thank you for choosing this piece and giving it a watch. If you're new to the channel, maybe this is your first time here, I want to say thank you and welcome to the channel. I hope that you enjoy this type of content because I've got a ton of other videos, both woodworking and non-woodworking related. And if you like this type of stuff, I'd love to have you stick around, hit that thumbs up button, as well as that subscribe button. That way you can follow along with builds like this, as well as many other things that I have coming up in the future. And for those of you that have been longtime subscribers, thank you. Thank you so much. I really appreciate each and every one of you. Now, with that said, let's get back to this project. There's our fretboard. Nice fret slots on there. This fret slotting miter box works really well. Sometimes it takes a minute or two to get your depth set correctly, but once you get everything set, the whole process goes pretty quick. This took probably, I don't know, 10 minutes or so. Really not all that long, and works really well too. I always end up using more double-sided tape than I really need, but part of that is because I don't want to take any chances with anything coming loose. Just have to be careful when you're peeling it off. I've never broken a fretboard peeling it off, but I suppose it's not out of the question. Just in case any of you are curious as to what double-sided tape I use, this is a 3M 9579. I've made a short video kind of talking about this tape. I'll put the link down below in the description, but a lot of times I get questions where somebody's curious as to a particular tool or material, so that's the tape that I use, 3M 9579, not sponsored. And right now seems like a fine time to cut this fretboard to length. Before I can glue this fretboard to the neck blank, I need to establish a center line. I'm going to use the jointed edge to make all of my measurements off of because I know this edge is true. That way when I actually mark the center line, I know it's going to be in the right place. I'm carrying my center line around the front. Sometimes it makes it a little bit easier if it wraps around when you're trying to line it up with the center line on your neck. Now we can add our truss rod. And we're ready for glue. Now when it comes down to gluing on the fretboard, I don't get too wrapped up in where the glue goes. The only thing I really try to do is keep most of the glue away from the truss rod so that I don't get an excessive amount of squeeze out somehow binding up the truss rod. I've experimented with taping it off on different builds, and for the most part, I've never really noticed any difference either way. I think as long as you're mindful with how much glue you're applying, you're going to be okay. And of course, if there's carbon fiber rods, I don't worry about them. Most of the time, glue goes right over top of them anyway. They're not supposed to move, so if glue gets on them, I'm not concerned. I think the biggest thing is, like I said, just being mindful of how much glue you're applying and trying to keep the majority of it out of the truss rod channel. But really, I don't get too wrapped up in all that. One last double check. Center lines are good on both ends. We got a little squeeze out all the way around, but not excessive. Now, we can just let this dry for a while.
Once the glue is dry, I'll take this piece to the bandsaw and ever so carefully trim off the excess fretboard material, being very careful not to nick the edge of the neck. And once again, we'll fire up the router table with a flush trim bit and trim the fretboard perfectly flush with the maple. And it's now time to fire up my headstock thicknessing jig, which is really just my oscillating spindle sander with a jig that I made to hold the headstock at a 90-degree angle. It's adjustable from the back side so that I can take off a little bit at a time until I get down to the thickness that I need. Another benefit of this jig is that not only does it thickness the headstock, but it puts a nice rounded transition between the headstock and the fretboard. All I need to do now is a little bit of cleanup sanding to remove some very tiny divots in the face of the headstock.
With the headstock transition all sanded in there, we probably got a little bit of finish sanding on that, but it's nice and flat, and now we can drill out the tuner holes, which I've already got marked out.
I'm using a stepped drill bit made specifically for drilling tuner holes. These are a great alternative to using multiple sizes of drill bit so that you get the stepped hole. And while that's not impossible or all that difficult, this is a huge time saver because you really only have to set it up once.
Just a side note, this drill bit in particular gets really hot when you're using it, so I never take it out right after I'm done. I just let it cool off. I don't know why it gets so hot, but it does. Now we're going to use this somewhat wonky looking jig. If you've seen some of my other guitar neck builds, you've probably seen me use this jig. This is what I use to route the little relief here where I put the logo for Haley Guitars. This jig really just holds the neck in place so that I can use this little template here to guide the router to cut that little relief. Now I can use a straight cutting bit in my router. The bearing will ride right along this edge and cut the little relief. While I was routing this relief, I had the branding iron heating up. It's now time to add the logo to this neck and make this an official Haley Guitars. This is something that I always do at this step before I remove anything from the jig. That way everything stays in alignment. Just in case the brand doesn't come out exactly as I'd hoped, I can take my router, drop the bit just a tiny bit more, cut that brand off of there and rebrand it, and really everything's going to line back up. If I were to remove it, I guess there's a slight chance that it might not line up, and by doing this now, make sure that nothing gets out of alignment. Nice. Well, that turned out awesome, and I think this is one of my most favorite parts of any build, putting the logo on there. Now, we're in need of some fretboard markers. Here's the fretboard markers that I'm going to use. I made these by cutting out some spalted maple on the laser cutter.
In order to get these to come out nice and clean instead of just looking like a burnt chunk of wood, I had to use light power and a ton of passes. I think I used like 35 passes at a light power in order to get them to come out like they did.
I think if I glue these in with the little black lines all running in the same direction down the fretboard, I think it's going to be kind of cool, kind of a nice detail, and should give a right amount of pop to that rosewood. I'm just using regular wood glue to install these, but I'm going to use a little toothpick to kind of spread the glue around in there. Cool. I think that's going to look nice. I figure while I'm waiting for that glue to dry, I may as well go ahead and drill the side dot markers. Now somewhere I have a jig that I always used for doing this to hold the neck at the right angle, but for some reason I can't find it. So I've just got it clamped to a board just to help hold it at a right angle to the drill bit. It's going to be just fine.
I'm using regular wood glue to glue in these side markers. I just dip the end in some glue, tap it into the hole, and trim it off.
It's now time to get a little bit of a workout and sand a radius into this fretboard. 14-inch radius, skyscraper guitars, cool orange. Let's do this. Once I get the initial radius along the fretboard, then I switch to some smaller blocks that have different sandpaper grits on there, and I really just work up through the grits. I'm going to take this up to 2,000 grit. Might be overkill, but I like the way it looks and I like the way it feels, so that's what we're doing. Once I'm done sanding the radius, I'll double check it with one of these radius gauges. I like to put a backlight against the gauge. It really helps me see if there's any light coming through in any one area. That's looking good. I think we're ready for some frets.
Now I've done frets in other guitar build videos, so I'm not going to go too in-depth here. You can scroll back on the channel and watch some of the other videos if you need a little more information. But a brief overview of my process is to pre-radius the fret wire, then I'll tap the frets lightly into place, trim them to length, and then once I have them all into place, I'll use my fret press to seat them all into the fret slots.
All the frets are started. Now I'll use my modified arbor press to press everything down in, get everything seated. I gotta do this carefully because the fret ends always seem like tiny razor blades and I always end up cutting myself. So I'm gonna try not to do that this time around. If I had to choose one downside of using an arbor press to press in the frets, it would be the fact that I like to work eye level with the press. That way I can make sure everything's going in nice and straight. And I don't really have a good spot to build a very tall stand to work at eye level while standing. I think that would be ideal. So I find myself really just kneeling on the floor so that I can see everything. That's really the only downside that I can find to using this type of a system.
Now I'll use my homemade fret end files to file the ends flush, as well as my beveling file to put a bevel on the end of the fret wire.
When I'm all done, I've got a mess of filings to clean up, but you can see that the ends of the frets are flush with the fretboard, and I've got the beginnings of a nice bevel on there. once we polish the frets later, this is going to be nice and smooth. I take the bevel down until the file just knocks off this sharp corner of the fretboard. I think that's important to make sure that's a little bit rounded off. That way you're not grabbing a square edge. And I think we're well on our way to having a nice, comfortable neck. And now we've come to the part of the build where it's time to throw on some headphones, put on some good music. It's time to shape this neck.
After securing the neck to my carving buck, I armed myself with my Shinto rasp and began carving. I feel that this process is kind of personal, as a lot of people have different methods for shaping their necks. I'm using kind of the faceted approach by taking off the outer corners first, and then that leaves you sort of a hexagon shape. From there, you remove the corners, creating more sides to the hexagon, and then eventually rounding everything off and creating the profile that you want. Once I start to get a bit of material removed, then I start to take some measurements so that I know where I'm at the first fret as well as the 12th. I'll also re-sketch my center line so that I always have a line to follow and everything stays nice and even while I'm removing material. Once I have the rough shape carved, then it's time to grab some smaller files and rasps and do some of the detail work in the transition areas in both the heel and at the headstock. And then, of course, we can't forget about the sanding. I usually start out by using a strip of sandpaper and sanding it basically across the grain. I only sand the neck like this immediately after I'm done carving because it can give some pretty nasty cross-grain sanding scratches that can be hard to remove. And since I know that there's going to be a lot of finish sanding to follow, I know that I'm not worried about those sanding scratches staying in there. The thing I do like about sanding this way is that if you have any micro facets in there left over from your carving, this helps to remove them and really starts to make the neck feel smooth and rounded. After a whole lot of sanding, my fingers tell me that this neck is smooth. I use my fingers at this stage because you can feel these imperfections even if you can't see them. Everything seems to be feeling good, so I'm going to call that a win.
The profile of that neck is feeling really good. Still a little bit more sanding left to do, but I think we can address that when it comes time to do all the finish sanding before we apply any finish. I got a little bit of a mess here to clean up, and then I think we're going to wipe a little mineral spirits on here and just see what this figure might look like once we apply some finish. Oh. Oh yeah, that's cool. Oh, that's going to be awesome. I hope the camera can pick that up, because that figure in there really pops. Oh, wow. This is going to be cool. And with that, we're going to wrap up this video right here. The neck is done, save for a little bit of finish sanding, which we'll get to later. I'm excited. I am really liking this, especially as everything starts to come together. In the next episode, we're going to do the finish sanding, final fitting of a couple things, and we're going to work on the finish mainly. And I can't wait to see what this looks like once we get some finish on there. It looks cool with just the mineral spirits, but finish I think is really going to make a difference. Hope you enjoyed this. Make sure you hit that thumbs up button as well as the subscribe button so you don't miss the next episode when we start applying the finish to this neck as well as the body. Thanks a lot for watching. We'll see you next time. Wow. Why didn't I use this neck blank sooner? It's probably been sitting around for a year or two. Man.